So I will text this or scan it and send it to you. So you will have it, to use, as you are out and about.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I'm happy to have that.
We may have a few more coming in a few minutes, but I'll go ahead and start with the introductions. I first met Charles back in the late 90s. I think that's when it was, when I was tapped to help write curriculum on the new study catechism. Study catechism was a project that the denomination was putting together. We had been using the, in our book of confessions, we have the Heidelberg Catechism that comes out of the mid-1500s, and the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which comes out of 1647, I think, or 8. My memory holds me correctly. And there was no new catechism, which is a question and answer way of learning the substance of the faith based on the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments. And so the denomination came together and decided we would do 3 new ones, one that was designed for children, one that was pitched for confirmands, and then the study catechism that was for adults. And I was teamed with a woman named Ruth Faith Santana Grace, who just finished up a 2-year cycle of being co-moderator of the denomination. And she and I wrote study catechism curriculum based on the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments portions that was geared for lay leadership development. Another team wrote on the Apostles' Creed that was geared for just anybody. And I was asked to go out to the Office of Worship and Theology at the General Assembly, and Charles was working there, and in fact, another person who was working there, Martha Moore-Keish, will be teaching on the Barman next week as well. Barman is one of our creeds and confessions. Ken Handy tells me it's the least familiar to him. I asked him whether or not, in fact, that he was an expert on the Second Helvetic, and he told me that the bar was not raised too high. So we're looking forward to that. I first came to know about the Barman studying Bonhoeffer at seminary, and think that it is really one of our most critical guides as we seek to figure out what is our proper, excuse me, role and relationship of being a Christian in the state. So Charles has left the Office of Worship and Theology. He is now at Columbia Seminary in a dual role. He works in the development office, but also is an adjunct in theology, if I remember correct. And he is an avid bicyclist. And if I remember correctly, a Duke fan or Davidson?
Well, both. I'm a Davidson and a Duke grad, so go Devils.
Got you both. All right. We welcome you, Charles, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let Alex figure out everything we need to go. Okay.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I would normally have some introductory remarks and all that kind of stuff, but today I'm going to jump right into it because I have too many slides. Martha will be with you next week to talk over the content of the Theological Declaration of Barman. I'm tasked with doing the historical background, and I find this really interesting, and I hope you will too. So I'm going to begin, as all presentations on the Theological Declaration of Barman begin, with Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Dr. Ruth, the famous sex education person, died on Friday at age 96. Dr. Ruth was a Jewish child in Germany, about 5 years old when the events that we're going to talk about today happened. Her parents eventually sent her to boarding school in Switzerland, and both her parents were taken to a concentration camp where they were murdered by the Nazis. It just is a reminder to me, Faulkner said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And there are those who walk among us who have firsthand memories of the events that we'll talk about this morning. So, what is the Theological Declaration of Barmen? It is a theological statement that was adopted by the First Confessional Synod of the German Evangelical Church met in Barmen in May 1934 to withstand the errors of the German Christians and the right government. It is the theological basis for what became called the Confessing Church. And if some of these terms don't mean much to you at the moment, hopefully they will in a moment this morning. It's become a marker of faithful Christian witness since that time, and it was formally adopted in the PCUSA Book of Confessions in 1967 in the old UPC USA, and then in 1983 with the reunited Presbyterian Church. So let me give you a little background from the 19th and early 20th century. 19th century German Christianity, there was a noticeable undercurrent of identifying Judaism as a primitive fleshly religion, and Christianity was lifted up as a sophisticated philosophical religion free from superstition. And some theologians and biblical scholars and pastors became critical of the Old Testament and anything that would blur Jesus with Judaism. It's important to note that within the world of kind of Reformation era Christian traditions, the Reformed, the Lutheran, that kind of constituted in the United States what we at least used to call the mainline churches, that German scholars were considered the finest theological scholars in the world as a group. So they were kind of the center of Christian theological and biblical scholarship. There's a great line from Arthur Cochrane's book, which I depend on heavily in this, the Church's Confession under Hitler, where he says that World War I had little effect on the church as a whole. The so-called Christian nations that engaged in the war all identified God with their own cause and prayed to him for victory. But the end of World War I marked a much more virulent form of Christian nationalism in Germany. And we're going to go through that progression. So we're going to get to 1933 in just a minute. The last kind of thing before that is some things that Adolf Hitler wrote in his famous book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, 1925. The party would be neutral with respect to confessional differences. And confessional differences here mean primarily Lutheran and Reformed, but also includes Roman Catholic. Why? Because he argued that division of these churches from each other would serve the interests of international Judaism. All churches together were equally valuable supports, that should say for the nation. Sorry for that typo. So he was, secondly, in Mein Kampf, he said that religious bodies would be guaranteed freedom so far as they do not endanger the existence of the state and do not offend the moral and ethical conscience of the Germanic race. One of the things that he opposes very strongly in Mein Kampf is godless Bolsheviks. And so many in the church, leaders and pastors in the church and people in the pew, saw Hitler as a ally because he said he was going to allow for freedom of religion, and he was opposed to the godless communists who were the bigger threat most thought. He wanted Christianity to flourish to support the state and to defeat the Bolsheviks. And then he often would be publicly praising the church's importance while in private with his own leaders being committed to destroying the church as it was. Cochrane concludes from that one is either Christian or a German. You can't be both. So I'm going to go over a little German political history. So, in 1930, this slide is slightly wrong, and just realized the error this morning. There was an election in 1930, and the National Socialists finished well back. In 1932, there was the last free election in Germany. And I have here that the National Socialists won. They actually finished second to von Hindenburg, but they went from 3% of the vote in 1928 to about 31% of the vote in 1932, and were surging. So in 1933, 3 months later, Hitler is named chancellor by von Hindenburg. And here is a picture of the two of them together. Von Hindenburg names Hitler chancellor, and Hitler begins to amass dictatorial power. The next month, there is when the dictatorial powers come, and there is an emergency order, and you will see in this picture, this is the Reichstag, the parliament building, and there was a fire that was set there. There are lots of theories about who set the fire, whether it was Hitler's opponents or Hitler's party himself. But what it did, one way or the other, is that it gave Hitler the opportunity to claim emergency dictatorial powers over the state of Germany to fight against this terrorist activity. 1 month later, in March of 1933, so we're going to spend a lot of time in 1933 and 1934. That's pretty much the whole time period we're looking at. Parliament is sidelined, and by that I mean that Hitler's control over Parliament became absolute. In April, so 1 month later, is the first anti-Jewish action, and this is when Jews became ineligible to work for the government. The German government, Jews were expelled from civil service and were no longer allowed to be hired. In May of 1933, the trade unions were sidelined. And trade unions at that time in Germany were very powerful organizations, both in the way we traditionally think of them, but also as influential organizations within the society. That they had a lot of influence over policy and politics and such. And so this is a picture of soldiers closing down the trade unions. And this was one of the very last bastions of independence within the German state. And then in June of 1933, so this is just a 6-month period, any military leader that did not swear allegiance to Hitler and the National Socialist Party were taken out of command. And so within the 6-month period, Parliament, trade unions, and the military were all taken over by Hitler and his and the party, and everyone had to become so. The leaders of Parliament, the leaders of the trade unions, and the leaders of the military had to be members of the National Socialist Party in order to be leaders. So that's the first 6 months of German political history in 1933. Now, let's look a little bit at German church history during this time. So again, there's these elections that happen in 1930 and 1932. Where Nazis, National Socialists, the Nazis come into power. From 1932, there would not be a free election until after the end of World War II. In January of 1933, a group of church leaders, we're going to talk a little bit about the makeup of the 1932 election in a minute, but in January of 33, so at the same time that same month that Hitler is named chancellor, is the first statement. I think that's another typo. I think that's Altona and not Altona. A group of church leaders come together with the theme of their statement being The nature of the church can only be determined by the living Christ. One of the things you're going to see in this conversation about Barman is that the church used very explicit church language to try to express resistance to Hitler, witness against what was happening. And so instead of saying Hitler should not be named dictator or Hitler should not be able to take over the church, they would say the nature of the church can only be determined by the living Christ, which is very powerful. I just want you to note that kind of language. So then the emergency order and the dictatorial powers come the next month. In March, so the next month, Adolf Hitler gives a famous speech on Christianity. And I'm going to show you an excerpt of that. He said in this speech at the Reichstag, "The national government will provide and guarantee to the Christian confessions," and that's again the Reformed, Lutheran, and Roman Catholic, "the influence due them in the schools and education. It is concerned for genuine harmony between church and state. The struggle against materialism," that's code for the Bolsheviks, the communists, "the struggle against materialism and for the establishment of a true community in the nation serves just as much the interests of the German nation as it does those of the Christian faith." When this statement was published, the influence of the church in education was actually taken out. And it was only the influence due to in the schools was taken out, is only in sort of education more broadly. So what I want you to hear, when you hear Hitler saying that, we have, of course, pretty well-tuned ears to Adolf Hitler and his legacy. But at the time, many church leaders heard this and said, oh, he's against the materialism, that is communism, the Bolsheviks, and he wants us to flourish. And we have the same common interests. And so more and more church leaders became supporters because this sounded like good news to them. In April, so the next month, is the first German Christian National Convention. And here is, let me make sure I got the right. I think I missed a picture. But anyway, here is a quotation that came from that. This convention, Hermann Goering, I'm not exactly sure what his role was in 1933, but of course became the head of the Luftwaffe and one of the chief advisors to Hitler and had been for some years. This is what was said. This is the same quote, actually. Sorry, I got a little confused. I think that I made a mistake. I am going to read you what was said there because I apologize. There's so much information here that sometimes I get. This is the slide. This is a picture of the first German Christian gathering. And you can see the Nazi flag and the banner of the cross right there together. And then this is the quotation I wanted you to, I just had a little blip in the slides. The theme of this first German Christian convention, and the term German Christian, I'll say this a little again later, but German Christian here is a technical term to describe those people who saw the fate of the German state under National Socialist rule and the church as having common cause. It doesn't mean anyone who's a Christian who's German. German Christian becomes a party, a movement, a name of a particular thing. So this is the theme of the first German Christian convention pictured here. The state of Adolf Hitler appeals to the church, and the church has to hear his call. Now, what you will hear next week when Martha talks, presents to you, is how Barman talks about whose voice the church is to hear. And that is the response that happens in the Barman Declaration in the text of it is a direct response to this kind of language that was being used by the German Christians. The state of Adolf Hitler appeals to the church, and the church has to hear his call. Chilling words when you know what's coming next. I thought I'd corrected the spacing on this, but in May, a man named von Bodelschwing was elected the Reichsbishop, the bishop over the Church of the Realm, the German church broadly. One of the things that's a little complicated in German church history, it wasn't as many denominations and traditions as we have, but there are kind of multiple layers of church bodies. And so so the very first Reichsbishop that is appointed by Hitler to oversee church affairs in Germany was a gentleman named von Bodelschwing. Von Bodelschwing was a so-called moderate at the time. He will appear again in our story. And von Bodelschwing was someone who believed that there was a possibility of serving the Reichskirche, the Church of the Realm. There was the possibility of serving that church that is under Hitler's control faithfully and being faithful to the confessions and mission of the church. And he was trying to hold these two things together. But it didn't take very long for von Bodelschwing, actually just 1 month, for him to be replaced by a man named Müller. And Müller becomes the Reichsbishop, and Müller is much more radical about what it means for there to be a Reichskirche. This is Müller here, and you can see he's with a Nazi soldier officer, and it's a great kind of depiction in a one shot of the way that the Reichskirche and the military were together. So let me talk a little bit about that. So as I mentioned earlier, German Christian is a technical term in this context for those who tried to combine Christian faith with National Socialism. In this takeover of the Reichskirche, there was kind of a back and forth between the extreme and more moderate. So Hitler appointed some commissars of the church, and it turned out that they were too radical, and then he appointed ones that were more moderate and then back to more radical. By the time he appoints Ludwig Müller as Reichsbishop, the finances of the church are now under state control, and any decisions made by the Reichsbishop were enforced by the Gestapo. So back to this picture, the Gestapo actually enforced the decisions of the Reichsbishop. So Paul Althaus, it's hard to explain, to articulate just how important of a theological leader he was. He was a major, major figure in German Christianity and German scholarship. He was a professor of theology at Erlangen. He was just a major figure in the church. And he was probably the biggest Luther authority in that time period. And when Hitler came to power, he said, "Our Protestant churches have greeted the turning point of 1933 as a gift and miracle of God." It's just kind of amazing how that works. Now there were responses to this all over the place. So for instance, I'm going to get ahead a little bit, but just to tell you an example. In the old Prussian Union, which was the eastern part of Germany, the next year or 2 years later, they condemned a national racial worldview. So the church there stood up for a moment. 700 ministers were arrested the following week. That's the kind of enforcement that was going on. Eventually, many church leaders who were critical would be put in concentration camps. Actually, a remarkable number were not killed during that time, but it was a really there was an a large majority of the church welcomed Hitler's apparent affirmation of the church and the church's authority. So here we go. Mueller is elected to head the in July of 1933. Sorry, getting back to the history. So we just went through the first half of 1933. All of this moves very fast. In July, German Christians win an overwhelming victory in voting at a convention of the Reichskirche. Reichskirche, I hope I'm saying, is the Church of the Realm, the German national church. Mueller, who was already the Reichskirche, in August is elected to be the head of the Prussian church in particular. I said there were these overlapping churches. There was overarching structure, and then there were regional bodies sometimes overlapping. In September, ministers were discharged unless they unreservedly support the national state and the German Evangelical Church. The German Evangelical Church is the Reichskirche. So just as we looked at earlier that trade unions and the military and parliament, you weren't allowed to be a leader in those unless you were a member of the Nazi party and so fully supportive of the state. Now this, we have a similar move in the national church. And then in one of the moves that really spurred reaction by more and more church leaders was that any minister in the church who was either non-Aryan or was married to a non-Aryan were retired. They were taken out of ministry in the church. Aryan, of course, is a kind of a bizarre category. But like many racial or ethnic weaponized terms, it means really who is not eligible more than it means who is. So this would mean Jews, Poles, Russians, Romani persons, etc. That could not. No one could be a minister or even married to someone. So if you were married to a Russian or you were married to a Romani person, you could not be a minister anymore. Romani is, I think I'm getting this right, Romani is the more appropriate term for what we called gypsies when we were younger, who were one of the groups of people who were condemned in the Aryan, non-Aryan division. In September, so that same month, is when the Pastors Emergency League was formed. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but these are the pastors who are now saying we can't really function within our church structures in order to speak against what is happening. And so we are creating this kind of a temporary, I don't know if temporary is the right word, but we're an ad hoc group of people whose sole purpose is to resist what is happening in the German church. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer joins that same month. In November of 1933 is a huge date. This is when they had the first really big German Christian rally. It took place in the Berlin Sports Plaza, and 20,000 people attended. And this is a picture of that gathering. Now, again, this is just a few months after Hitler became chancellor. All this is happening within one calendar year so far. And so you'll see the Nazi banner, and then you'll see the words, the German Christian reads, and then in parentheses, in quotation marks, the gospel in the Third Reich. That is the theme of this convention of German Christians. I don't know what else to say about that other than that picture kind of says what you want to say. You'll see the Nazi banners are around the top. There's a big Nazi banner, and then there is this notion. And I think I find this especially offensive because of the use of the term gospel, or in German, Evangelium. You can see that, the long word in the middle. That the German Christians saw this as their expression of the gospel. This is what was said at that German Christian thing, that what was being looked for was not a Lutheran, not a Reformed, not a United, not a synodical or consistoral church, not an Episcopal or a church with general superintendents. That is, they didn't care about the structure of the church. So it's not, you could read this, not Lutheran, not Presbyterian, not United Church of Christ, not Methodist, not Episcopal, not Catholic, right? That's what it's trying to say in our terms. But now a new all-embracing German national church, that is the goal. The first step, Cochrane writes, must be to get rid, and then this is a quotation, of the Old Testament with its Jewish morality of rewards and its stories of cattle dealers and panders. Remember, I said earlier that in the 19th century, there was this, within German Protestantism, there was this growing stereotype of Jewish faith, Jewish religious practices as being primitive because of description of sacrifices. So that's why you get things like cattle dealers, and they're not sophisticated like us. They're low life. They're primitive, backwards. The New Testament needed to be expurgated of all superstitious passages, and the whole scapegoat and inferiority complex theology of Rabbi Paul had to be renounced. Even talking about Jesus as the crucified Christ, the crucified Messiah, had to be guarded against. Why? Because you needed to present Jesus as a heroic figure. The presentation of a heroic Jesus was a requirement. So not only was the Old Testament completely sidelined in this view, this version of the German Christians, but the New Testament was also rewritten to show Jesus as a power figure, not as a humble servant. Well, there you go. And then in December of 1933, at the time, being part of the National Youth Organization of the church was a huge deal. There were tens of thousands, maybe, at least tens of thousands of youth, maybe 100,000 youth involved in the German National Youth Program. And so, again, in a similar way that happened with these other organizations, in December of 1933, you could not be a member of the German Evangelical Youth Organization without simultaneously being a member of Hitler Youth. So that was another way to take over the church. So let me tell you, there was this rise of the German Christians that I just described. There was a fair amount of political deafness that was going on here. When the first effort to do Nazi control over the church in one state, Mecklenburg state, the bishop rejected the move, kind of one of the few places of resistance and standing up. But what happens is Hitler himself spoke to the bishop in Mecklenburg and said, the church is going to continue to be independent. Of course, when Hitler said that, he was actually being independent in a very small sphere of the way it was. But this pacified the bishop, so the bishop then publicly announced he had joined the Nazi party. The Roman Catholic bishops had forbidden Nazi party membership, which was another sign of resistance. But then there was a concordat with the Vatican, and this prohibition was lifted. If you keep up with, all of a sudden I'm blanking on the Pope at the time. I should know this cold. There's been a lot of historical work done on the Pope in the time of World War II. I'll think of it in a minute. But a concordant was reached, and Hitler was sidelined his most, in this case, he sidelined his most radical German Christian supporters in favor of more moderate leadership that could bring church and state together. So this went back and forth. There was von Bodelschwing, and then there was Mueller. Mueller, although I said he was more radical, was actually not nearly as radical as others. So Hitler was actually pretty deft in moving leadership around the church that would help him gain control. Hitler helped him become leader of the German Christians in East Prussia, as I mentioned earlier. Mueller was not, Mueller kind of wanted the German Christian church to become like the Church of England, and that would kind of unite all Christians under this one national church. And he had ambitions for him to be the leader of this church, but this served Hitler's purposes to have a single German church that would serve him. Next. So this is a map. Sorry, I guess you can figure that out. It's kind of silly thing to say. This is a map of the election of 1932. The red areas are where Nazis won the majority. So I've mentioned East Prussia several times. East Prussia is, let me see if I can get my highlighter, my laser pointer up here. East Prussia is this area here where the Nazis won large majorities and was the center of German Christian influence. This is the power center of the German Christian movement. When we get down here, you will see this part is green, or greenish brown. And this is folks who did not, where the Nazis did not win the majority of the votes. When we talk about the confessing church and the theological declaration of Barmen, it is in this green area where a majority of citizens did not vote for the Nazis that the confessing church and the Pastors Emergency League was the strongest. So confessing church, let me take the highlighter off. Oh, someone who wishes not to be named is in the same room as I am, reminded me it was Pope Pius. That was the Pope during World War II, and there's been a lot of criticism of him the last few years. So let me tell you a little bit about the confessing church in 1934, and then Barmen. I told you I had a lot of slides. So Martin Niemöller is the pastor who formed the Pastors Emergency League in the fall of 1933. By January of 1934, 4,000 pastors had joined the Pastors Emergency League. Now, just as a point of reference, this is after basically every other institution in the German state had come under Nazi control. So this Pastors Emergency League is doing what nobody else was doing. In 1934, they started calling themselves, people from the Pastors Emergency League started calling their version of a state church the Confessional Fellowship of the German Evangelical Church. If you can hear that, it's the German National Church. They're the Confessional Fellowship. They're people who are saying, we are not going to go with the rest of the German Evangelical Church, the Reichskirche. After a couple of free confessional synods down in that brown and green area voted to go with the confessional fellowship. They declared themselves, in essence, the true evangelical church in Germany. They basically said the German evangelical church, the Reichskirche, is a false church. So that's April, and there is a desire to have you keep using this word confessional, which comes more out of the Reform side, to say we need a theological declaration that will be a basis for our church together, that we can use to say who we are in the face of our opposition to the national church. So in early May of 1934, a small, I think it's 6-member or 8-member theological committee meets in Frankfurt. And then in late May is the Synod in Barmen, which is the document that you'll be looking at these 2 weeks. This is a picture of Martin Niemöller, the person who formed the Pastors Emergency League. He was put into a concentration camp, I think the year 1937, but I could have that wrong. And he survived through the end of the war, and he is considered one of the heroes of the confessing church. And if you look at any kind of resource, website, etc., that's about the church's role during the Holocaust, Martin Niemöller will often be lifted up as one of the Christians who stood up for Jews. But I want to just identify this notion of standing up for Jews, because that's not one of the whole questions about the confessing church in Barmen, is the degree to which that actually happened. So then there was this synod in Barmen. A man named Karl Barth, I'll show you his picture in a minute, writes the initial draft of the theological statement. Then they met in May. There were 120 delegates, and this is a remarkable fact. The average age of these delegates was about 40 years old. These were, in essence, younger people who were younger pastors who led this, and I think that's really important. A second draft is produced at the Synod meeting in late May, and there is a lot of Lutheran Reformed tradition. And you may or may not know this, but like Guy was saying earlier about these different confessions that the Presbyterian Church has, Reformed people have tended to write confessions periodically. Lutherans, Augsburg Confession was written during the time of Luther and is the authoritative confession within the Lutheran tradition. And so they were very suspicious of a new confession because does that imply that it takes the place of the old confession? Our friend von Bodelschwing, who I've mentioned a couple times, he was at this synod meeting, again, still trying to reconcile the this confessing fellowship and the Reichskirche. On the 30th, the theological declaration was adopted, but then they had to reassemble at 4 o'clock because they forgot to vote for it to be transmitted to their respective church bodies. Although it was adopted unanimously, over time, some people started to distance themselves as Nazi control over the church became more total. This is a picture of Karl Barth. He was the initial drafter. He actually did not speak publicly at the synod, but is widely credited with being the theological voice behind it. Just a cut. So I'm going to give you a little bit about assessing it. I know I'm getting close. Maybe we'll have some time for discussion. So Arthur Cochrane, and this is when I was identifying a little bit about not to too quickly move to, because they resisted the Reichskirche and Hitler, that they were necessarily standing up for Jews. So I think I have a fairly nuanced assessment here. Perhaps it is the nature of the case, however, that secular historians should ignore the church struggle. The church's resistance to Hitlerism, viewed politically in sociology, did not really amount to very much and had little apparent effect upon the course of events. I just heard a Jewish studies professor from University of Virginia, who's an expert on Barman, who said that using the term resistance probably isn't quite accurate. It's more like witness. That is, they spoke, they stood up, but they actually didn't in any concrete way provide resistance to what the Nazis were doing. They were too small, they were powerless. And although they were persecuted, Cochrane wants to remind us even the persecution of the church was light in comparison with the unspeakable sufferings of the Jews. So that's assessing Barman 1 by a scholar of Barman. This is Albert Einstein, of all people. This is what he said about the confessing church. Being a lover of freedom, when the Nazi Revolution came, I looked to the universities to defend it, knowing that they had always boasted of their devotion to the cause of truth. But no, the universities were immediately silenced. Then I looked to the great editors of the newspapers, whose flaming editorials in days gone by had proclaimed their love of freedom. But they, like the universities, were silenced in a few short weeks. Only the church stood squarely across the path to Hitler's campaign for suppressing the truth. I never had any special interest in the church before, but now I feel a great affection and admiration for it because the church alone has had the courage and persistence to stand for intellectual and moral freedom. I am forced to confess that what I once despised, I now praise unreservedly. And then Karl Barth himself. In 1933 and the years immediately following, at the time the National Socialists seized power, there was no struggle of the German universities and schools, of the German legal profession, of German business, of the German theater and the German art in general, of the German army, or the German trade unions. Many individuals, it is true, went down to honorable defeat, but in no time at all, those large groups and institutions were subdued and made to conform. Now he says, Barman confined itself to the church's confession, to the church's service, and to church order as such. It was only a partial resistance. What he means there is that in Barman and all this other stuff, what was consistently said is that the Hitler, the leader of the nation, does not get to determine the church's message, the church's constitution, the church's mission. But what you will not hear is reference to Jews. You will not hear reference to the silencing of persons. You will not hear the treatment of the Romani people or of Eastern Europeans. Even in, it was all about can Hitler run the church for the state's purpose? And they said, no, we can only listen to Jesus Christ, who is the head of the church. That's why he's saying it's only a partial resistance, and that's always important to hear. And in proportion to its task, the church has sufficient to be ashamed that it did not do more, rightly so. Yet, in comparison to those other groups and institutions, it has no reason to be ashamed, for it accomplished far more than all of the rest. That is the historical background to the Theological Declaration of Barman. So that kind of concludes the formal part of this presentation. I'd be happy to engage in any discussion or questions you might have. I'm shocked that we got through that quickly on those 37 slides, to tell you the truth.
Alec, do we need to pass the, are you gonna do that or am I gonna do that? Great. Questions for anybody? There's a lot of historical material with this that some of us are probably more familiar with than others. Ken? Hold on a second, we're gonna get a, so people on Zoom can hear it.
Can you tell us a little bit about the German church before Hitler? It was one church similar to England where it was a state church, or were there different Lutheran groups within Germany and other churches that were there that weren't Lutheran?
Yes. Yeah, so one of the quotations that I didn't put up was that the the theory behind the German evangelical church, the Reichskirche, was that it would do what the Luther's vision of the Reformation was supposed to do, which was to bring these churches that had become separated into one united church. So they use the language of ecumenism and of unity and of national church to talk about this. So there were there we're talking here major church bodies. So we're not talking about like Brethren or Mennonites or other kinds of free churches that were smaller and around. There were basically three churches that in Germany that were sort of these large entities that were involved in this conversation. Roman Catholic Church, which I mentioned. The Lutherans were semi-united. And by what I mean by that is they had bishops, like there was a bishop of the East Prussian Church, a bishop of the church in Mecklenburg, a bishop of the church in Westphalia, I think. And these bishops were powerful. The German church was, in essence, the Lutheran church that had these synods that were had a lot of power within the synods. And then you had the Reformed Church, which is where the center of the confessing church was in many ways, which tended to be down in that southwest portion and were more heirs of John Calvin, were similar to Presbyterians. So what was happening both in the Reichskirche and in the confessing church was to bring the two Protestant traditions that were most important in Germany, the Reformed in the Southwest and the Lutherans in East Prussia and Northern Germany and places like that. The Lutherans were everywhere, but particularly dominant there. Kind of bringing them into unity on these two different planes, one allegiance to the Reichskirche and one resistance to it. I find to be, I can't say much more than that because the German church structure was complicated and I don't know it backwards and forwards, but that's the big picture.
Nancy?
Picking up on that theme a little bit, it strikes me that the either radical idea or offensive idea of what you described wasn't so much a national church, because all over Europe that was not uncommon, right? The US sort of stood alone in this separation of church and state. It was only the character of the Third Reich which made it so terribly offensive. Would you say that's so?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. When I said that Hitler was fairly deft in some of his political maneuverings, what he proposed was a unified national church that would fulfill many of the dreams of all the people, all the church leaders. A lot of them were not happy with having divided church life, right? The ecumenical spirit, becoming one in Christ, all these kind of things. And he was able to harness that good and appropriate instinct with service to the national church, service to the National Socialist ideology. So yes, you can have a national church that, in the United States, we have tended to resist the notion of a national church, but the notion of a national church isn't in and of itself the problem. It was that in Hitler's mind all along, the question is what happens when you have to make decisions, when you have to decide between values. And it was clear that what Hitler wanted for the Reichskirche was the German state always prevailed in any kind of tension between the gospel of Jesus Christ and, as we saw, the gospel of the Third Reich.
Alec, Ken?
In the takeover by the Nazis that you described, what was the relative importance of the threat of violence by Gestapo versus other forms of negotiation or persuasion or what they?
Guy, can you repeat that? I had there was a little echo there.
I can repeat it for you, Ken. Go ahead.
The question was, in the takeover by the Nazi Party, what was the relative importance of the threat of violence by the Gestapo versus other forms of labor?
Yes, the violence, at times there was explicit violence, but violence was embodied by brown shirts who came to German Christian conventions, who were visible everywhere, and the fact that any pastor who spoke out was imprisoned often. So it wasn't, as far as I can tell, there wasn't like many. I don't know of any church gatherings where German police or military presence would come in and like beat people or things like that. But there was imprisonment and the symbol of the violence that was going on in other places. It actually reminds me a little bit of when you look at the New Testament and what is going on with Roman occupation and the way that the Roman centurion embodies the power of the empire by their very presence. They don't have to pull the sword out. They don't have to. The fact that they're there in the Roman centurion garb signifies the power and potential violence of the empire over against. And when German Christians embraced the brown shirts who had been violent in many other places within the culture, when those people would come and be present in church gatherings, the threat of violence was implied. Now, of course, when you have people eventually going to concentration camps, that's a much more explicit form of violence. But in some sense, the takeover of the German church was bloodless in a certain way, if you know what I mean. I mean, it was implied violence. It was the threat of violence, but it wasn't actual, not a lot of actual beating or killing.
A couple of years ago, I had one of our members teach on the book Preaching in Hitler's Shadow. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all,
Yeah.
Charles.
Yes.
And it was a very helpful way to get a cross-section of what was coming out of pulpits that were pushing back. And one of the things that we haven't talked about was the program to eradicate those with physical and mental illnesses.
Yes.
Within,
yes.
and a number of the pastoral sermons that were coming out of there were from pulpits where parishioners had their children who were had physical or mental illnesses taken away in the night and eradicated. And so I appreciated very much your raising what the Barmen did do as far as preaching, but also the limitations to it. It wasn't as strong as we would have liked it to have been about the Jews or the Romanes or others. And yet it was a point of protest, and there were people within the movement who were stronger in voicing some of those concerns than others.
Right.
Remember, and I can't recall the name of one of the pastors who I think's grandparents or parents had been Jews, and he converted to Christianity and was pretty powerful, and yet because of that connection, he was deemed to be non-Aryan and lost his pulpit because the pay was you were a civil servant if you were a pastor.
Right. Yeah. The history the history we went over is just the May 1934. This is before the widespread, the concentration camps. The final solution is still, we're still working toward that. This is what, 15 months of history, beginning with Hitler becoming chancellor. And a lot of things weren't yet clear, including, I think, persons with disabilities being targets of the Nazi regime.
Yeah, and I think we Americans tend to think about World War II starting right in Pearl Harbor, right? December of 41, and forgetting that in the European context, and especially the German and Polish context, I mean, this is happening in the 30s. The Poland doesn't happen until September of 39. And so all of these things that are going on within Germany and around the church, so that Barman comes out in the early 30s as part of the church being able to see what are the implications of this kind of marriage of church and state, I think is fairly prescient and important. Yeah.
Yep. Barman is, but can I just say, Barman is both an amazing witness and a demonstration of sometimes the church is becomes so focused on its own life that it misses some of the bigger picture.
Yeah, good. Anything else? Next week, Nancy?
Sorry, one other context. It was very helpful to see the context from Parliament and then the military and the unions sort of fall by the wayside. Can you give us a sense of the power of the church in Germany at that time? Was it a political force at all? Was it like U.S. today, 30% of the church or something like that?
Oh yeah, yes. The church was an incredibly significant entity, and as Guy just said, pastors were paid. They were kind of civil servants. It was embedded in the very fabric of the state. So the church, one of the reasons Hitler talks about the church in Mein Kampf is because it is one of the 4 or 5 most important institutions in the state. It is military, trade unions, universities, and the church are kind of in kind of business, but business is a little less organized. And so Hitler identified each one of these areas as places to go. So when the German Christians went wholeheartedly with Hitler, that really became kind of, with all these dominoes going, when all that happened, that really gave him total control. And the church really folded really quickly, despite the fact that it had immense social and political power.
One of the things that they'd often say about German women in particular, that they, the 3 spheres was, let me get my German right, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, the kitchen, and church were sort of areas. And as far as membership, I would think 75–80% of the nation. And again, there was a famous book written in the 1950s in the United States called Catholic Protestant Jew. And it was sort of saying in the 50s in America, you identify, if you're going to be a good American, you identified as one of those 3. And I think clearly within Germany at this period, overwhelmingly, the identification would have been, again, Lutheran, Protestant, or Catholic. And Hitler had some of his own issues with trying to build bridges to the Catholic Church. He was very afraid that the Catholic would turn against him. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Charles, for giving up your Sunday morning to be with us. And look forward to having you come visit in person again at some time soon. And next week, we'll have Martha pick up and continue to work with us on the Barman and probably what it says. Let me close with prayer. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Thank you, God, for a chance to try to set our creeds in history so that we better get a sense of how we might be faithful in our own time and place. What it means to confess your name and to be your church amidst different and challenging political situations. We thank you for Charles and for his work with Columbia Seminary. We ask your blessing upon that rich institution. Guide us now as we go and give us your grace to confess our faith in a challenging world. For it's in Christ I pray. Amen. Thanks, brother. Good to see you.
Good being with you. See you soon.
Bye.
What do I think of?